Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Getting Over versus Being Put Over. I am your host, and let's go ahead and get into the situation. The situation, ladies and gentlemen, is money. Being paid what you feel that you're worth, which is a reoccurring thing in the wrestling business for many of decades, I'm sure. And looking at the current sports entertainment business, I'm sure there are there's a lot of ways that people are getting screwed out of money. Certainly a lot of people who are not getting paid what they're worth. Certainly people harping upon it. Look at Ryback, for example. If you've ever listened to his podcast, he talks about it occasionally on how he feels that he wasn't making what he was worth and how everybody should be paid equally, whether you're a headliner or not. That's a rough one, but we can touch on that later. But you see this throughout the wrestling business, and around throughout the sports entertainment business, I should say, on the concept of money and being paid for what you do, because essentially you're putting your body on the line night in, night out. It's not going to be glamorous. It's not going to be, for some people it won't be tens of millions of dollars. For most people it won't even be millions of dollars. So it's a situation to where, are you going to make it in the long term? Are you going to make it from a financial standpoint, I should say, before your body gives out? Because there's a lot of guys who came in with a lot of talent, a lot of charisma, a lot, and the body just couldn't handle it. It's not incredibly uncommon. You find that in professional sports as well. So when you think of the wrestling business, right, do you really think, well, first off, do you guys know what wrestlers make? Two, do you think they're being paid what they earn, do you think they're actually being paid what they deserve? And three, and most importantly, will the business ever get back to the way it was back in the, I don't know, maybe the 60s, 70s, and 80s, to where a lot of the promoters were literally printing money, and everybody was, well, not everybody, but most people were rather prosperous in a particular territory? Or is it going to be one of these situations where you're wrestling for one promotion and then you're going to Japan, or maybe you're in Mexico as well, and you kind of just have to travel around, especially if you're on the indie circuit? That's what we're here to talk about today. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to be presenting you a video by... Sorry, I got a list here. Let's see. I got a video here. Jim Cornette on how much wrestlers made. Keep in mind, not what they make, but what they made. This is from March 12th of 2012. Should be a good video and whatnot. Give us a bit of an insight on how the financial aspects work and so on and so forth. If you guys ever get a chance, for any of you guys who are into wrestling memorabilia, you can find some of this sometimes on Jim Cornette's website, actually, where sometimes he sells a bit of his memorabilia. There's a couple other places too where you can find it authentic, I should say. Don't get ripped off by the generic or the knockoff shit. You can actually see pay stubs, or you can actually see actual copies of paychecks that rather famous wrestlers at one time or another actually made, which is a really cool thing. And if you guys ever get a chance, I hope to go over a few of those later on down the line, because there's a bunch of videos on wrestlers making money, or lack thereof, is what the old promoters' books look like. So back in the day, I'll try to be brief about this and we'll get into the video. Back in the day, let's take someone like Fritz Von Erich, right? He would sit in his territory after a big event or whatnot. He would either cut checks. He would go to this book, basically the what's the actual term for it? Let's just say he goes to his pay book. He opens that up. Okay, give me the total of what we made for the night. He goes ahead and takes that tally. Okay, this, and this is what the boys make. And you just start, and the names are already there, and all he does is write a total next to it and just mark it off. Each and every one down the line. What the refs make, all that bullshit. Security, so on and so forth. He passes the book on he'll pass on a slip to somebody else. Someone else goes to the back and dolies up the money, basically. Puts it in envelopes, and then the boys come and pick up their checks, and then they move on, pick up their cash if they don't want checks, and move on to whatever the next town is, or whatever the next event is, or so on and so forth. You hear a lot about that in Memphis as well as in a couple of other places. We're talking about thousands and thousands of dollars being doled out. You have other promoters who were known to go ahead and dole out tens of thousands of dollars out of their cars, out of the trunks of their cars at times. Very amazing shit if you ever get a chance. But listening to podcasts where they actually talk about these old books and whatnot, I know Jim Cornette as well as Dave Meltzer has talked about this. Getting a chance to see some of the old books. Bruce Pritchard has spoken on this as well at times. It's an amazing, it's an astounding amount of money for the time that's being doled out to these guys. And then when you go ahead and do, when you do the adjustment to what that amount of money was then to now, it's a lot of money. It's a ridiculous amount of money. And you got to think too, this money, ladies and gentlemen, is being paid out to guys who put their bodies on the line, like I said, night in, night out. And the guys who are the real earners, right, are the people who can follow directions, have a little bit of imagination, and who are willing to work hard. Those are the only three facets that you kind of need. You know what I'm saying? And you can be either an Adonis or be a slob, and you can still get over in almost any territory. It's kind of crazy if you think about it. If you really give it some thought. And then when you start getting into wrestlers who wanted to actually buy into the territory or buy into the promotion, then the money gets even more astounding. But anyway, ladies and gentlemen, let's go ahead and get into this video. I think it's going to be great. And, yeah. welcome to the show, if you will. And I'll see you guys in just a second. Oh, boy.
Oli Anderson, I questioned him. I grilled Oli in the lobby because this is a subject that I was reading, actually, Don Fargo's new autobiography, which I got the first day of FanFest. Scott Teal's done a great job. Don Fargo, possibly one of the most fascinating wrestlers that has ever lived. And was probably the only guy that worked on network television for the Dumont Network in the early 50s and worked on ESPN in the 90s. His book came out, and that started me thinking, because it talked about the many promotions that he'd worked for. And then I got to started thinking about how now that the wrestling business is folding up and constricting and being smaller constantly, and whatever happens with TNA and Spike TV or wherever they end up on television, they're cutting people. The WWE has cut more people, released more people.
And shit, TNA don't even really exist anymore. Dixie Carter kind of did in with that. Even though you can kind of, if you really think about it, like the people that Dixie Carter brought in, plus the incompetence of the people that were there, not everybody, but some of the people that were there is kind of what screwed her out of her father's money. But that's something for a whole nother conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here. Excuse me. Let's see here. The title is Jim Cornette and How Much Money Wrestlers Made. Yet again, this is from March 12th of 2017. Now, he actually, Jim Cornette here brought up Oli Anderson. And I actually have one of these coming up with speaking on Oli, at least when it comes to Black Saturday. Now, Black Saturday, ladies and gentlemen, I won't get into too much of it here, but for some of you guys who know, you know. But Black Saturday was basically when Georgia Championship Wrestling basically got yoked up from under itself, which led to Vince getting their time spot, which led to the forming of WCW and billionaire Ted Turner getting into it, and kind of the beginning of the end in a lot of ways. Like that actually pretty much locked in all the pieces for Vince for the most part. Don't get me wrong, it was still a dogfight from there on out, but like you could say very well that Georgia was like the last territory to kind of fall, because Southern wrestling was the last bastion that was still alive, if you think about it, when Vince went on his tear. Now granted, Oli is at the center of it, because Oli in his own way kind of started it. And if anything comes out of Black Saturday that any of you guys can take to any type of consideration, you don't fuck over Jim Barnett. That's the key. You do not fuck Jim Barnett. That's at least that's what I took from it. To be honest, there was a reason why the NWA brought him in back in the day to fight the war and essentially win it, at least for a little while, and so on and so forth. He wasn't anybody to play with. And that whole situation too, or that started, ladies and gentlemen, over money. Very interesting story. Like I said, I hope that we'll be able to tap into that at a later time and date. So just to give you some credit, to give you guys a preview, I should say, of what's coming up next. But also, to be fair, Oli Anderson wasn't a stupid person or a stupid guy. He really wasn't. He was he's grumpy, as you would assume from older individuals, but he had a good head for the business. I think at the time that he ended up becoming Booker, though, later on in his career, he had a lot of things going on in his personal life. Shit was kind of just getting hectic. He shouldn't have been booking at that time. Maybe he shouldn't have been doing anything with wrestling at the time because he was kind of in a fuck it type of mood at that point. I don't know. I think Oli gets a bad rap at times, but I think he does have to own up to what happened. Not to say that he hasn't owned up to it, at least not that I know of, but he does deserve some of the criticism that happened with Georgia Championship Wrestling and Black Saturday in general. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. Let's continue.
Wrestling is supposed to be this big multi-million-dollar industry, and up until a few weeks ago, when the stock market told him different, the guy who owns the biggest company was supposed to be a billionaire, right? Then how come nobody's making any fucking money in the wrestling business except for like 40 guys, maybe? And I realized that Oli is one of the last guys that can speak of this in a first-person account. And so I got some information from him. And you looked up a piece for me. Oli Anderson was a main event wrestler. But he also was smart enough to become a booker, matchmaker, whatever you want to call it. And he also was smart enough to get ownerships or percentages in the businesses that he worked for and was integral to. He was not only a main event guy, he was also the booker in a lot of places or a lot of instances. And he ended up owning and was the majority owner until Vince turned that south, the Georgia territory. So the point I'm making is in the late 1970s, let's say 1978, for example, Oli Anderson, because he was being paid as a main event wrestler, because he had a percentage of the towns from Jim Barnett that he booked for Barnett, anywhere from 2% of a town to 4% of a town, Oli was making over $250,000 a year in 1978. And you looked up and translated it into today's money, that's $750,000.
God damn. Now, and that was a year. That was a year what Oli was making. And then on top of that, too, not only did he own a piece of some of the places that he worked, and not only did he kind of multitask, because that's where your value's at, ladies and gentlemen, in anything that you do. The more you know, the more you can demand to be paid, because the more you know. You know what I'm saying? The more you know, the more valuable you are. You know what I'm saying? You're not just an asset, you're a very valuable asset. And then after a while, you start to become, you're irreplaceable. You know what I'm saying? Depending on what you're doing. Anyway, but on top of that, didn't they say that Oli used to own like a, I don't know if it was like a paper mill or like a lumber mill up south or up north and shit at one time or another? Like, Oli did decently well with his money. You know what I mean? It wasn't like he was like some of those guys who would sit there and buy a fucking bunch of expensive cars and all that bullshit. He may have, but he didn't completely waste his money on that. Like, he actually did shit with his money. You know what I'm saying? He really diversified his earning ability and whatnot. And that right there is a very good mindset to have. And not just in wrestling, but in anything that you do. You know what I mean? The more you know.
Oli was very unusual. But I can think of other people. Jerry Lawler, who had 10% of Memphis. Now I'm doing King's tax returns on the air, but I'm sorry. Jerry Lawler had 10% of Memphis from, the time that Jerry Jarrett split off from Nick Goulas until 1983 when he became a 50% partner in the company. But just on having 10% of Memphis and working as a main event wrestler in the Tennessee territory, I was in Louisville Gardens one night when they were handing out the paychecks. And this was right around Christmas of 1982. And Lawler gave me my check, and it was like $500 or $600. And I'm 22 years old and I'm a junior manager. I just made $600 for working 6 days. I'm happy to be there, right?
Yeah.
But I look on his desk in the little office he had in the gardens, and there his check was just laying there on. I mean, it was just not covered up by anything, right on top, and it was for $3,842 or so, 38 something. And he saw me looking at it, and he said, "Yeah, maybe if you." Lawler's always been a little bit of a wise ass. It's part of his charm. He said, "Maybe if you stay in the business long enough, Jim, you'll end up getting a check like that." And of course, me being wide-eyed and innocent, I said, "Jerry, was that just for last week?" He said, "No, that was for last Monday." He had 10% of Memphis, so him and Bockwinkel in the AWA World Title match drew a $38,000 gate. He got $3,800 for going to work 12 miles from his house, and that's in addition to wrestling in the main event in Louisville and main event in Nashville and whatever. So that week he probably, he made between $5,000 and $6,000. I would think that his average weeks, according to the houses in Memphis, were $2,000 to $4,000. So
and remember, we can triple that basically in today's.
Yeah, this is 1982, and he probably, and that's without, and he was also working in that year in Florida. And he also made shots in the AWA. So everybody says, why didn't Jerry Lawler ever leave Memphis really and go anywhere and stay instead of just making shots? Why the fuck would he? Because once again, you triple that. And that's what I'm trying to get across, is that a lot of people don't realize that it was easy. It was easy to be an underneath guy and, make $20,000 or $30,000 or $40,000 a year in the wrestling business 30 years ago. Everybody in the business was doing that, and there were hundreds of them because there was 25 territories. But for the
25 territories, Jesus Christ! And yet again, you could say, well, I think it's fair to say that Lawler was a homesteader. I think we spoke about that in the last one of these, where a homesteader is someone who goes into a territory and basically plants roots, and usually gets a piece of the promotion when they do so. It's one of the lures, if you will, of getting them there. And Lawler made a lot of money out there. Lawler has had some great feuds, you know what I mean, in his area. Made a lot of money. Great talker, great worker. You know what I mean? The most physically appealing, I suppose, from a wrestling standpoint, not necessarily. Didn't have to be, though. You know what I mean? If you could talk a good game and then back it up in the ring, who gives a shit? You know what I'm saying? If you can make people, if you can get over with the audience and make them love you and hate you on a whim, who gives a shit? And you don't have to leave your territory. You can bring people in. You know what I'm saying? So why should the king leave the kingdom when he can bring his opponents, when his opponents really have to come to him? He don't have to go to nobody. And the best have gone through that territory, have gone through Lawler and whatnot, and hence the reason why the money was cut the way it was cut. But I didn't know he had 10% though of the territory. I didn't know that. I thought it was like 6 or 8, but which, my apologies for selling him short. But 10% though, 10%. God damn. Oh. But see, could you imagine like a CM Punk? You know what I'm saying? Like working a territory and being like, yeah, I want, this guy's getting 7%. I want 15. You know what I mean? Or can you imagine a Ryback being like, oh, this guy made $8,000 last Monday? Oh, well, I want 8,000. You know what I'm saying? Oh, yeah, well, you were in a dark match, though. I don't care. I want 8,000. It gets silly when you think about it.
Who say,
but that was the price for loyalty back then. And the price for grinding it out. You know what I'm saying? Being there for the good times and the bad. It all pays off usually in the end. At least it used to.
The guys didn't make big money until Vince came along. Yeah, if you got to be a main event star in your territory where you either got the book or you got a percentage or you bought into the whole thing or you were a main event guy like an Ernie Ladd who flew between the New York territory and the Buffalo territory and the Texas territory and wherever, and the Mid-Atlantic, wherever, because he was an international star in the 70s. The NWA World Champion, we've already talked about with Larry Matizik, how the payoff for an NWA World Title match on a sellout house in St. Louis was $6,000 or better for the night. So they were making $2, $3, $3 or $4, $500,000 a year. Just the schedule would kill you. There were big money spots in professional wrestling, and when you take into account the number of territories and the number of really big names, there were easily 40 guys making, low six figures in the wrestling business as promoters or bookers or matchmakers or main event talents. And now there's 40 fucking guys. Some of them are making millions. But I wonder, maybe somebody should do this research, as we've gotten completely off topic here and I go on this rant. Somebody should do this research, Alice, and figure out how many wrestlers working for the WWE and TNA are making, potentially after they pay all their road expenses, which most of these guys still do, are making six figures in the wrestling business anymore. I don't think it's as many as everybody thinks.
I wouldn't think so either. And I imagine a lot of that has to be down to the fact that WWE is this giant corporate entity. I'm going to assume, and you can correct me, of course, that in the territories, there can't have been that much corporate infrastructure. Go on.
To quote Guy Coffey, they run $1 million business like a flea market.
And that's why, that way you could basically pass that money directly onto the workers, because it's not going to.
Well, no,
imagine
the money was never passed directly onto the workers.
Well, not directly,
but not even indirect.
I mean.
Actually, very indirectly. We used to call it running it through the separator. When Eddie Marlin in Memphis, there was a bag man in every territory. The bag man was the guy that was in charge by the owner and the boss of the whole territory, bringing the money back from spot shows and places that settled in cash. And those guys were generally old, well-respected wrestlers, family members, both, generally armed, people that you wouldn't want.
You had to be armed back in those days, because there's you had some guys out there who would be like, okay, the bag man's going to come at such and such day, more likely such and such time to pick this up. I mean, maybe we can catch them slipping. Maybe we can catch them lacking. And we can get that. And that stuff never usually works out. Never usually works out. If you dig deep into some old articles going back, I think as far as the 70s, maybe even certainly in the 60s, for sure, you hear about small instances of, somebody got shot, usually a shot into the to the kneecap or to the shoulder, over a particular situation. Guys getting their windows busted in. It's an ugly business, or at least it was. I mean, it still is, but it was an ugly business when it comes to going to collect this money. A lot of a lot of these venues, I should say, who would have these spot shows, sometimes they would actually provoke the situation by saying, oh, well, yeah, just go ahead and come pick it up in cash. It's probably best if you do that. You know what I'm saying? I don't want to cut a check. Just go ahead and come pick it up in cash. Yeah, go ahead. Just show up and do that. Just to try to intimidate the situation and be like, hey, we kind of feel like we shouldn't have to give you guys this much of a cut. Maybe we'll just give you this and you should be okay with it. And he has like 3 or 4 fucking huge ass guys behind him. You know what I'm saying? Even having respect doesn't mean that there isn't someone that's going to try to get over on you at one time or another. There's some interesting stuff if you're willing to look. Very interesting stuff.
Want to fuck with, and most of all, trustworthy. And for Jerry Jarrett, it was Eddie Marlin, who fit all of those categories. But there was a different one in each territory. I'm sure Bronco Lubitsch carried a few satchels full of money around in the Texas territory. But the point is, the promoters would leave buildings. When we ran Bogalusa, Louisiana one time, Mid-South Wrestling.
Too. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know exactly how trustworthy you guys would feel, how trustworthy of people you guys are, right? Don't take it as I'm taking it as a shot to you, but let's say this, let's reword that. Would you trust somebody with, I don't know, about 70 $80,000, $100,000 of your money in their trunk, would you really trust them to drive around the area and pick up these large satchels of money for you and bring back all of it, every last dime, receipt and everything? Do you guys have enough faith in another person to do that? Because I'd be nervous as fuck. Oh, please believe I'd be sitting in my office right now being like, oh, I will bust a cap in his knee if he's off by $1. If it's short by 1 red cent, that's his ass. I don't care if he had to use that shit to pay gas. I better get every last dollar and red cent of my money. But a lot of these guys did that. You got guys driving around town with $100,000 plus in their trunk. Just, walking into a place, picking it up. Most of the time, if most venues were smart, give them a receipt and then walk out. Some bagmen were known for even sitting there and having them count the money up in front of them to make sure it was all there before they left. You know what I mean? So this way, yet again, you don't get in any heat when you drop the money off later. Just something to think about, ladies and gentlemen. Could you trust another individual with $100,000 of your money? Yikes.
And the high school football field, and it did a $35,000 house or $40,000 house. There were over 3,000 people there. And most of those purchased their tickets as they walked up. There was a hell of a jam at the box office, and it's a high school fucking football field. It's not, Ticketmaster wasn't involved in this, right? There was no surcharges. And you were driving backcountry roads in any territory in the country with suitcases with $20,000 and $30,000 and $40,000 in cash in it.
And I guess this was a time when there wasn't a branch of your local bank every single place you went.
Well, and you didn't want to take it to the bank right then anyway, because first you took it back to the office and you ran it through the separator.
Right.
And what you did was you put it all in a bushel basket and all the cash, and you threw it up in the air, and whatever stuck to the ceiling, that's what you paid the talent. And but no, in all honesty, being a wrestling promoter was a license to print money. I'm sure that all of that cash didn't get documented. When you go back and look at the records and you see the sheer numbers of people that went to wrestling matches and all the territories, it was a license to print money in some respects. If you got your territory off the ground, got it going, got it successful, got it established, kept good talent in, that whole 9 yards. I mean, territories did go out of business, but for the good ones, and there were a lot of them. So,
it's actually kind of hard to do that too, to keep a territory going, because obviously you got people that will raid your territory for talent. You'll have people who will push in on your territory, usually outlaw type promotions who aren't affiliated or whatnot. And just more importantly, just keeping the boys happy and in check, because it's very easy for someone to be like, hey, just go ahead and, how much are you getting over there? And just come over here. You know what I'm saying? We'll pay you more over here. And a lot of these guys will just make the jump. You know what I'm saying? I mean, some of them, though, are so, if you're good enough, you can make the jump to multiple territories. You can pull that situation off multiple times and still go back. You know what I'm saying? Because at the end of the day, at least for most promoters, business is business. Vince is like that in a lot of ways. Vince McMahon. He says a lot of... He actively promotes it as business is business, there's no hard feelings. Granted, there is something that I'm working on that should come up eventually about Macho Man Randy Savage and the issues that him and Vince had stemming back to like 94, I believe. I don't have my notes in front of me, but stemming back to like 94, and why, and obviously Randy's no longer with us, but why that situation never kind of smoothed over, unlike the situation with Hulk Hogan, or with some of these, or even with Bret Hart, as well as other people that Vince has had issues with over the years. He never squared things away with Macho Man. And it's a shame, because in Macho Man's later years, there was money to be made. There was definitely, on both ends. Like, they both could have made ridiculous money together, which is what should have happened. It's what should have happened. If Vince can go ahead and let everything be forgiven and forgotten with some of these other dudes, he could have let Macho, should have been given that opportunity as well, and he didn't. and there's a lot of speculation on why not. And I think a lot of people want to focus on this one particular part, or this one particular situation, which is scandalous in itself, on why that's the issue. But I hope, I'm not going to be presenting to you guys anything that probably hasn't been said before, but I hope to present something to you that's a bit more, that has that goes through some of the layers and some of the issues over the years on why maybe they never were able to reconcile. You know what I mean? And one big thing that I think that should be pointed out is, as you know, Macho Man Randy Savage is in the WWE Hall of Fame. If I remember correctly, I either heard that on a podcast or I read that in a wrestling newsletter, the Wrestling Observer. I read it somewhere where Macho Man said that if he ever gets into the WWF Hall of Fame, WWE, sorry, he wanted to have himself and his family inducted in. He didn't want to go in alone. He wanted to go in with his family. And I think eventually his family conceded and they were like, no, we would rather just have Macho go in, because if not, more than likely they weren't going to make it in. Because Vince was definitely like, nah, I'm not going to do all that. I want him in. You know what I mean? Not to necessarily be disrespectful to his family, but he's like, I want him. I don't see a need to put all of you in. It's kind of shitty, but that was Macho Man's last wishes. And they weren't granted. And that's really shitty, to be honest, but at the same time, if you're his family, you want the best for his legacy. You know what I mean? So I guess I can understand that. But I can also understand why, if Macho was alive, he'd be pretty pissed off about that.
There were under the table deals made all the time with guys. Jimmy Valiant was so important to the Memphis territory where he wanted to go to the Carolinas, where he could make more money per week because the towns were bigger. But Jerry Jarrett and Jerry Lawler bought him a house in Memphis. Not a giant mansion, but a fucking house. This was 1981 or whatever. So what did a house go for in Memphis in 1981 to get him to stay? And he talks about it in his book. He stayed a few months, but then, he just knew he had to go to the Carolinas. And so he left the keys to the house in their mailbox and left them a note that said, sorry, Kingfish, got to go.
Wait,
and that's the case.
These people enticed you with a house. They bought it. You lived in that house for a couple of months and then left? Holy shit. I mean, did you pick that? Now I got some questions. My first question is, did you agree to have them buy you the house? First thing. Secondly, did you choose that house, or was that a house that they already chose for you? And third, I'm anxious to hear how your relationship panned out after the fact. Because, ladies and gentlemen, if I bought somebody a house, I kind of expect you to live in it. To be honest. I kind of expect you to live in it. To be honest. But, I don't know. At least they didn't pull no Suge Knight shit. So, if any of you guys know anything about that, he's been known to buying his artists, or former artists, I should say, houses and shit and cars or whatever, but keep it all in his name and just take it back later on. Yikes.
So anyway, guys could work themselves into top spots. There were more of them. There were more territories to learn. And it may not have been possible for a wrestler to make $1 million, although some promoters did in the course of a year. But a lot more guys were making money. And I had that conversation with Oli, and he gave me some firsthand account. And everybody say, oh, Oli exaggerates. But no, when you put together the figures and the facts, it's fucking true. And it was a practice for promoters to give their bookers a guarantee per week above their wrestling pay, or a percentage of the town or whatever. So it was based on their performance and everything. That was done in a lot of cases. That's how Georgia got fragmented and ended up enough people owned enough percentage that Vince was able to get it out from under Oli to begin with.
Wow. All right. So the thing is, as it pertains to with Georgia, it wasn't just Oli who owned a piece of it. The Briscoe brothers actually owned a piece. As I said, Jim Barnett did, and then there was maybe like one or two. There may be a few other people also that were in there who all owned a piece of that. And essentially, what Jim Barnett did here's what happened. I won't get into it completely, but basically, Oli pushes Barnett out. Barnett goes to Vince and takes a job as being an advisor. Barnett tells Vince how basically Georgia works, how he lays out the whole business plan. Then he goes back to the Briscoes and a few other people who owned a piece of Georgia Championship Wrestling, and convinces them to sell to Vince, which they do. And at least with the Briscoes, they were given jobs. I'm sure they weren't the only one, but they were given jobs as well. And one day, Oli wakes up and he owns basically nothing. He owns 10% of nothing. End of story. It's a very interesting situation on how all that played out. And there's a bit of hypocrisy in a lot of that as well. But we'll save that for another time. I think it's an interesting story to be told, but there's a lot of them. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening in. I very much appreciate it, and I will see you. I will see you guys for the next one, which, let's see here. I don't know. There's so many good ones to go over. There's so many good ones to go over, if I had to be honest with you. But I will see you guys for the next video, whenever that may be. Hopefully sooner than later. I don't want to promise on what day this will come out. I want to try to... I'm asking for them to have this come out on Sundays, but we'll see. I'd like to try to keep as consistent as possible with that moving forward. But I make no promises, because you shouldn't make promises you can't keep. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Getting Over versus Being Put Over, and I've been your host. And I'll see you guys for the next one. Take care. Thank you. Fuck you. Bye, bacon.